Thank you, Silas, for reading that for us. You're going to be opening up your Bibles to Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11 will be there in just a moment. Have any of you ever had an out-of-character moment? An out-of-character moment? This happens to me. I'm sure it happens to you. Just this past week, I shared with Savannah a moment where I felt I acted out of character. And I spoke with her about that, and you know, we have these moments of out of characterness, and typically when we speak about acting out of character, most of the time we're speaking about, man, I have a really strong character, and if I'm acting out of character, it means I've stepped outside of that, and I've acted in a way probably that doesn't honor God or honor my past reputation maybe that I've had. And really, one of the most formative moments of my life was a moment when I acted out of character. And I can't remember if I've shared this story with you before or not, and I won't share all the details. But when I was a senior in high school, I had a very out of character moment. When I was a senior in high school, I got ejected from a baseball game. That's the part I won't go into detail, but I really made a fool of myself in a baseball game and got ejected. And the formative part around that is I was really held accountable for my actions, and our principal called me into his office, and I got a lecture there. And then my punishment was for the rest of the school year, I had to mop the lunchroom by hand every day after school. And what a blessing that was. At the time, it wasn't a blessing to me, but it was really formative for me and helped shape me into who I am. And I bring that up because the lunchroom that I mopped, we shared a lunchroom. Our high school and our middle school shared a lunchroom. And so the lunchroom that I was mopping is a lunchroom that I'd been in from 5th grade through 12th grade. And the ladies who worked in the lunchroom, they had been working there, most of them, for the entire time that I'd been in school there. And when I would come in and mop, I remember probably the third or fourth time that I mopped, one of the lunchroom ladies pulled me aside and she said, "Have you done something wrong? Are you in trouble?" And I was like, "Yes, I got in trouble." And I shared with her what happened, that I got ejected from a baseball game. And she put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "We thought it was something so much worse." And basically what she was saying, she said, "We know the kind of person you are, and we couldn't have imagined what you must have done to get in trouble, to have to mop this lunchroom." And it was this moment that was also formative for me because it reminded me, man, you don't know who it is that notices you, who it is that maybe watches you from afar. I knew these lunchroom ladies. I did not know them by name. But yet they had noticed that I was probably someone who is normally quiet, well-behaved. And obviously I had acted outside of that in order to receive this punishment. There's a lot of life lessons that I learned from acting out of character and the things that followed up with what happened when I acted out of character. Now, a lot of us can point to out of character moments. I only hope that your out of character moments were as formative and informative for you as that one was for me. But I bring up out of character moments because what we're looking at when we get into Mark this morning is what many view as an out-of-character moment for Jesus, and really an out-of-character series of moments for Jesus. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you, Jesus was not acting outside of his character, but our perception often is that when Jesus, as what was read for us, curses the fig tree, and the story that follows it immediately, when he goes into the temple and flips over tables and drives people out with a whip, our temptation is to look at that and to say, that seems a little out of character for Jesus. You know, if I was maybe reading the gospel for the first time and I didn't know all the stories of Jesus and I got to this moment in the story, if I was reading it for the first time, I probably would think, well, that's not what I would have expected from Jesus. Our attitude, our view, perception of Jesus is often solely the Jesus who is always showing compassion, the Jesus who is always maybe having a soft and kind word for someone, the Jesus who is always healing people. And that is who Jesus is, but there is more to Jesus. There is more to Jesus than just the kind word. There is more to Jesus than how he had compassion on the weak and on the neglected and on the sinful population, there is a side to Jesus that drives people out with whips. There's a side to Jesus that flips over tables. There's a side to Jesus that curses fig trees so that they die. If you're a tree hugger, this lesson is not going to be for you this morning because we are looking at a story where Jesus curses and kills a tree. Why is that? We're going to explore that a little bit in a moment. As we are entering into our study in Mark chapter 11 this morning, Mark uses a literary device that many call the Mark sandwich or the Markan sandwich. And many times when Mark is going into stories, he begins a story, he tells a complete story, and then he ends the first story. Okay, so you see here what we're going to look at this morning. The story of the fig tree begins. You have the story of Jesus cleansing the temple, and then the story of the fig tree ends. And this is a literary device that he uses often within his book. And it's a way that Mark shows that, hey, everything that we're talking about here is actually connected and part of the same story. There's a fancier name for it, but I prefer the Mark sandwich. I think that's the one that we should go with. So we're going to read together Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 33. So we're going to read the Mark sandwich and then an additional, maybe you could call it the bottom loaf, bottom piece of bread there on the sandwich. We're going to add a little bit to it there at the end. We're going to read Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 33, and Mark is indicating to us that this is all part of the same story. That is why he chooses to write the story this way. So Mark chapter 11, starting in verse 12, and it says, "On the following day when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, 'May no one ever eat fruit from you again.' And his disciples heard it. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers?' And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city." Verse 20, "And as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, 'Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered.' And Jesus answered them, 'Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you and your trespasses.'" Verse 27, "And they came again to Jerusalem. And as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, 'By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them?' Jesus said to them, 'I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me.' And they discussed it with one another, saying, 'If we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But shall we say from man?' They were afraid of the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, 'We do not know.' And Jesus said to them, 'Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things.'" So there's our reading from Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 33. So as we look at the Mark sandwich here of the fig tree, Jesus cursing the fig tree, Jesus cleansing the temple, and then the fig tree withered and died, here is what is going on. The fig tree is a representation of the Israelites at the time and how they had missed out, as Jesus had previously said it, on the visitation of the Lord. How they had missed who Jesus was. And not only had they missed who Jesus was, the reason they missed who Jesus was is because they had perverted the law that God had given them. They had corrupted the temple, which is why Jesus chose to cleanse it. So the fig tree is representative of the Jewish establishment at the time. So Jesus goes to the tree, he condemns it, and as you know at the end of the story, it withers. and it dies, and it is destroyed. This is further represented in the temple. Jesus goes into the temple, and Jesus turns over tables, and Jesus throws people out and drives people away, and he cleanses the temple. And it's all a parable, really, that Jesus is living out in person of his view of the temple and the religious authorities of the day. What I want us to do this morning is to examine the forgotten Jesus. The forgotten Jesus. The forgotten Jesus is the Jesus that is overlooked, the Jesus who turns over tables and who does more. As we go through, we're going to go through passage by passage here in a moment. And as we go through, we're going to grab a fuller picture of who Jesus was. And we're going to see this, that Jesus condemns, that Jesus confronts, that Jesus pushes, and that Jesus withholds. These are not verbs that we would normally ascribe to Jesus. And really, as we look at it, many of us maybe would think, well, these are verbs that probably don't describe who Jesus is, but it actually does. There's a fuller picture of the traditional picture of Jesus that is depicted. There's a fuller picture for us to grasp and understand that we can benefit from. Okay, so first, Jesus condemns hypocrisy. Jesus condemns hypocrisy. In verse 12, it says this. At the beginning of the passage we just read. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. The stories we are about to go through, with the fig tree, the cleansing of the temple, and Jesus' authority here at the end of the story, these can only be understood within the context of what is going on in this picture, in this time period. Okay, the context really of what we talked about last week in our study and what we're reading about here. Okay, if you just try to understand the fig tree without understanding where Jesus is, where he's heading, and what he's doing, you will not understand what the fig tree is about. Okay, the fig tree is about the temple. Okay. So Jesus sees this fig tree. Jesus has a hunger for the fruit of the fig tree. He sees that the fig tree has leaves. So the fig tree is presenting that the fig tree is in blossom. The fig tree is presenting, by nature of having leaves, that there is going to be fruit on the fig tree. Jesus goes to the fig tree. He doesn't experience fruit. So he condemns the fig tree. He curses it. What Jesus is doing here is Jesus is instructing his disciples, the last line here, and his disciples heard it. You know, we would read this story, and this might be a story that we would expect from many other quote-unquote religious or deistic beings outside of the Bible. Okay, so there's all sorts of stories of powerful little g gods who have been on earth, who have done things in a selfish way. When you read this story, at face value, it seems almost selfish of Jesus, that Jesus was hungry, that Jesus didn't get what he wanted, so what did he do? He became vindictive, and he hurt the tree. But the story is about the Jewish people of the time and the temple. The story is about having a false presentation of who you are, and not having real substance behind who you are. And Jesus is calling out the hypocrisy of the Jewish people of his day, specifically the hypocrisy of the religious leaders of his day. If you remember, as we looked at last week, where we closed last week in Mark 11:11, Jesus has the triumphal entry, and he goes, and in verse 11 it says, "And he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. And then it's the story of the fig tree. Jesus goes into the temple and he looks around, and he sees how it's become a den of robbers, and he's not happy with it. He sees how the temple is supposed to be a place that is representing God. It's a religious building filled with quote-unquote religious people, and yet when Jesus enters it, he doesn't find real religion. He finds hypocrisy. He finds people that are perverting who God is. He finds people that are defiling the temple that God has instructed for his people to have. So the fig tree is an example of this. He goes to the fig tree, a place that is a tree that is presenting that it should have fruit. It doesn't have fruit. It's hypocritic. It's a tree living in hypocrisy. So Jesus curses it. Fruit is a big deal in the Bible, and I think probably because of this story. As we've alluded to several times as we've been going through our study in Mark, Jesus did good things because they were good to do, but a huge reason that Jesus did good things was so that he could teach his disciples what it meant to be a follower of his. And his disciples really, of course, clung to all of his teachings. And he had this teaching on fruit, and his disciples clung to it. And it becomes a huge point of teaching in the New Testament, this idea of fruit. So here's a few examples of the importance of a Christian bearing fruit in their life. And this idea of bearing fruit is that if you are truly a Christian, you should be someone who is not only talking the talk, but walking the walk. There should be evidence in your life of a transformation that God has done within you. These are all evidence of the fruit that is supposed to be in the Christian's life. So as we think about the fig tree, as we think about how we need to be people who are people of fruit, since we are Christians, we ask the question, if Jesus did an inspection of your life, would Jesus find fruit or just leaves? If Jesus did an inspection of your life, would he find fruit or just leaves? A just leaves Christian is someone who presents as Christian, who outwardly shows that they are Christian by word, by maybe Facebook posts, by maybe trying to maintain a certain reputation, presenting as Christian. But if there's no fruit, they're not bearing the fruit of what it means to live within Christ. The danger is that there is destruction. The danger is that they experience the same fate that the fig tree. And I could make this very individual, but what I want to do before we move on is if Jesus inspected our church, would Jesus find fruit or just leaves within our church? If Jesus came and inspected the Hartselle Church of Christ, would Jesus find a church that is fruitful or a church that's just presenting as being a fruitful tree? Now, I believe Jesus would find great fruit with what we do here as his church here in the city of Hartselle. But these are the kind of questions we need to ask so that we are consistently challenging ourselves, so in that future generations we do not slip into a church that is only filled with leaves, that only presents as Christian, but actually are people who bear the fruit of mercy and justice, of forgiveness, kindness and compassion. If not, we risk destruction. As William Barclay wrote on the fig tree, the whole lesson of the incident is that uselessness invites disaster. You know, if you look at the statistics of churches within the United States of America in the last 20 years, that statistic has been on the decline. Churches are in decline. Church attendance is in decline. Churches every year are shutting their doors and closing up shop. Why is that? I think it's because a lot of churches have been leaf-only churches, have been churches, as how William Barclay would say, their uselessness has led to their disaster, their destruction. And I'm speaking about congregations. I'm not speaking about the Lord's universal church, which Jesus says the gates of hell will not prevail against and will always be here. But as members of a body here within Morgan County, we need to be people who find ourselves useful, who collectively use our talents and our gifts in order to serve the Lord, in order to bring about the Lord's glory, in order to further the Lord's kingdom, bear the fruit of what it means to be the Lord's church. If not, we are like the fig tree, inviting destruction amongst ourselves. As we continue to pursue a fuller picture of Jesus, we see that Jesus confronts corruption. Jesus confronts corruption. In Mark chapter 11, verses 15 through 17, it says this: And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." The religious establishment of the time had become supremely corrupted. And we've done past lessons on why it is that pigeons is mentioned here and the importance of that. Essentially, very briefly, quickly, pigeons were the sacrifice that typically the poor people offered because they didn't have money for larger animals. So the poor were the ones who offered up pigeons as sacrifice, and the vendors within the temple courts had marked up the prices for the pigeons, which means they were exploiting the poor people, and that's why Jesus was one of the reasons that Jesus was so upset, was not necessarily because of the vendors there, but because of the exploitation of people of what was going on there in the temple. Jesus saw this corruption, and he had to act. So he went in, and he lectured them. He did lecture them, but he also lectured them by flipping over tables and as Matthew's account says, forming a whip and driving people out of the temple. Jesus had a deep love and passion for the city of Jerusalem. He had a deep love and passion for the temple. We read last week about how Jesus stood over the city of Jerusalem and he wept for what it had become because he was so passionate about the Lord and what the Lord had established. And he saw that being completely corrupted, and he had to act. There's a lot of lessons there for us as Christians. I think there's a lot of challenges there for us as Christians as well, maybe to explore at a different time. Let me show you what Jesus is referencing here. When Jesus calls what's going on in the temple a den of robbers, he is quoting from the book of Jeremiah. And in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 7, starting in verse 9, it says, this is the Lord speaking, "Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods that you have not known? And then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, 'We are delivered,' only to go on doing all these abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, declares the Lord." So when Jesus says this place has become a den of robbers, Jesus is alluding to that this place is a place where there is stealing, murder, adultery, swearing falsely, making offerings to other gods. Jesus is alluding to that when he goes into the temple and says this has become a den of robbers. And behold, I myself have seen it. Jesus is God, and Jesus is there amongst the temple saying, I am seeing this. I see what you people are doing to what God has given you, and I can't stand it. There is a conviction that Jesus has in the temple that we as Christians need to have. A conviction to uphold the things that God has given us and to uphold them as holy. There's also the conviction that we need to look internally at times. That we need to allow Jesus' transformative work to be on a global community level, but we need to allow Jesus' transformative work to be on an individual heart level. And every now and then we need to look at ourselves and understand that we've been told that we are now the living temple because we as Christians are people who house the Holy Spirit of God within us. We are now the temple. And at times we need cleansing. And at times we need Jesus to come into our lives and to confront us on ways that we're living, things that we're doing. We need Jesus to come and convict us of those things and to turn over the tables within our life that we have let distract us from who God truly is. What in your life needs Jesus' confrontation? Maybe Jesus needs to do some transformative work in your life because of fill in the blank. I don't know what. Maybe it's the media you consume. Maybe it's being quick to run and to share, to spread gossip. Maybe it's the way you treat your spouse. Fill in the blank. All of us need to be evaluating, what is it that needs transforming in my life? And understand that sometimes that's a painful process. Each of us could answer that question independently. We each bear our own struggles, but each having the need for Jesus' confrontation and transformation. Next, as we seek to pursue a fuller picture of Jesus, we see Jesus pushes your faith. Jesus pushes your faith. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots, and Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. And Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Let's go ahead and read the next part. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also, who is in heaven, may forgive you your trespasses. Now, we could take this passage, and we could pull it out of this story of Mark, and we could take it out, and we could look at some real principles of prayer and faith, and be able to apply that to our lives in a beneficial way. I think the most benefit we get from, though, is to read this story within its context and to understand why is it that Jesus is saying these things in this moment, okay? So remember, Jesus is always teaching. He is teaching his disciples. Jesus is always preparing his disciples to take up his cause and to carry on his cause for the rest of their life after he is ascended into heaven. So, Peter notices the tree that's withered and has been destroyed. And probably not immediately obvious to us, Jesus launches into a discussion about faith, prayer, and forgiveness. And how is that tied to the fig tree? Remember what the fig tree represents? Fig tree represents the temple. The fig tree represents the establishment of the Jewish religion of the time. Jesus is encouraging his disciples. He is pushing them to be people of faith and forgiveness. Why those things? Because when Jesus enters into the temple of the day, he does not see people who are of faith. He sees people who have used religion to corrupt themselves and to corrupt others. He sees people who have taken God's law and are not acting faithfully on the law that God has given them, but instead taking in the rules and instructions that the Lord has given them and figuring out ways to dance around those rules and instructions that the Lord has given them, and ways to justify themselves. Not to let the Lord do the justifying, but ways to justify themselves in the unrighteous way that they are living. He sees people who are not people of faith. Jesus goes into the temple and he sees people who do not have a forgiving bone in their body. People whose judgment upon others that are weaker than them, that they view as lesser than them, he sees no forgiveness in these people. So when Jesus is brought up, or when the issue of the fig tree is brought up to Jesus, he starts speaking about faith and forgiveness because he wants this to be what the apostles take with them as they are people who establish the Christian faith in the future. He pushes them. Now, he pushes them to an extreme degree. Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, if you say to this, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, that's a hyperbolic idiom of the time, a common phrase used in the time. Jesus is showing that his people are people of faith. that his people are people who believe that God's work is truly good and truly powerful, that God is one who truly answers prayers for those who humbly go before him. So they need to be people of faith, they need to be people of forgiveness. Lastly, as we seek a fuller picture of Jesus, we see that Jesus withholds from the fraudulent. Jesus withholds from the fraudulent. Here at the end of the story, in Mark chapter 17, or Mark chapter 11, verse 27, it says, "And they came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, 'By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them?' And Jesus said to them, 'I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me.'" So they come to Jesus, and they say, "Man, we got to know. Why is it? Where does he have the right to flip over tables? Where does he have the right to speak with authority the things that he is saying? How is it that he is able to do that?" So they go and they ask him. And Jesus says, "I will ask you a question." Now, Jesus is asking this question, and he's not asking this question saying, "Hey, if you get this question right, then we can talk." Jesus is simply saying, "I'm going to ask a question, you just answer it. Just answer it." And Jesus' question is, "Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me. Give me an answer on that, and then we can talk about whose authority I'm working under or working with." And they discussed it with one another, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But we shall say from man." They can't say that. Why? Because they were afraid of the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." You see what's happening here? These people come to Jesus, and I think they really want an answer. They really want an answer from Jesus. So they ask him this question, and Jesus does what I think he still does today when we are battling with our faith with Jesus. Jesus gives the opportunity for more, for them to step out more in their faith. But they don't step out. Jesus says, "Hey, I'm going to ask you a question. You just answer it. I'll give you the answer you want." He asks them the question. They've already condemned and executed John the Baptist, so they can't say he's from God, because then they have to admit, well, we killed someone that God sent. If they say he's from man, then all the people who love John the Baptist are now going to hate the people who are saying John the Baptist is from man. So they view themselves, we're in a catch-22. We can't give an answer to Jesus. If we say this, we get one thing. If we say this, we get another thing. So we'll just say, we don't know. Do you think they had a real answer? I think so. They view John not as a prophet from God. They view him as just a regular man. And they could have said that. But they were weak, and they were afraid of what the crowds would do to them if they said that. So they weren't being genuine. Now, I think if they would have said either answer, it would have been an opportunity that Jesus would have taken advantage of, and he would have talked about who he really was from. But they didn't take advantage of the opportunity that Jesus had given them. They squandered it. So Jesus withheld further teaching. Jesus withheld from them further blessing because they were not genuine in their answers. It reminds me of what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 23 when he's speaking about the Pharisees. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." These men who came to Jesus were filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. Why? Because they came to Jesus in a duplicitous way. They came to Jesus with ill intentions. And it brings about the question that all of us must answer. Are we going to be people who are God-fearing, or are we going to be people who are culture-fearing? The people of Jesus' day that he was speaking to in this moment, they were fearful of their culture more than they were fearful of the Lord. They were fearful of their culture, of what their culture would say about them. Now, their culture was a religious culture. but they were fearful of what that culture would say about them. That's the same principle we face today. All Christians, we need to really firmly decide, am I going to be a God-fearing Christian, or am I going to be a quote-unquote Christian who is more afraid of the culture? Am I going to let God be the one who instructs and informs and transforms me? Or am I going to let the culture be the one that instructs and informs and transforms me? I need to submit to God. Understand His authority. Let His authority be what rules in our lives. We can either be God-fearing or culture-fearing. Can't be both. So here it is, a fuller picture of Jesus. Jesus is someone who is loving. Jesus is someone who is compassionate. He does have mercy. He has kindness. But Jesus is someone who is dedicated to the holiness of God. Jesus is someone who is dedicated to the holiness of God's people. He's not going to let those things be corrupt. He's not going to stand by while those things happen. So this is a fuller picture of who Jesus is. Now, this lesson has not been particularly encouraging, has it? It's been challenging for us to think about Jesus in these ways and for us to think about maybe the implications of Jesus being this way. And this is a fuller picture of Jesus, that He is someone who condemns, confronts, pushes, and withholds. But the full picture of Jesus is that Jesus died for the hypocrite, that Jesus died for the corrupt, that Jesus died for the faithless, and that Jesus died for the fraudulent. That's the full picture of who Jesus is. That even when we were sinners, that He died for us. That's the gospel. That's the good news. And His death brings about a hope. It brings about hope for all of us. Whether in our past we've been someone who has had a lot of out-of-character moments. In our past we've been someone who is maybe deeply hypocritical. Maybe extremely corrupt. Maybe that's how we're currently living. The good news, the encouraging news is Christ died for you. Christ died to save you. Christ died to transform you out of being a hypocrite, out of a slave to corruption and sinfulness and lawlessness and hypocrisy. Christ died to offer you a hope that you cannot offer yourself, to deliver you from sin that you've brought upon yourself, that you cannot break out of. He died to bring you the hope of freedom from that. Have you experienced that hope? This morning we're going to sing an invitation song, and it is an invitation for you to evaluate your relationship with God, for you to say, do I have the hope that Christ brings? Do I have the hope that He has delivered me from a life of sin to a life of righteous living for Him? He has offered that for all of us. Maybe upon hearing God's word this morning, you look at your life and you say, I've never clung to that hope before. I need to become a Christian. That opportunity is here for you this morning. If you believe in the Word of God, if you believe that Jesus is who He says He is, that you're going to let that transform you, you're going to repent, have a whole new way of living, you'll come before the church and you'll confess that you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and on that confession you'll be baptized for the remission of your sins into the Lord's church. Maybe you've done that before, but you look at your life and you say, it's not adding up to what I know to be a true representation of what it is to be God's people, and I need forgiveness, or I need guidance, or I need help, I need prayers of the church. That opportunity is here for you this well. If there's any way that we can assist you in your walk with God, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.